Hey there, diving right in today, and we're looking at this Israel-Iran conflict. Well, more specifically, you wanted to know about the global impact, right?
Yeah.
And let me tell you, this new snippet you sent, seriously eye-opening stuff. We're talking worldwide ripples here, especially when it comes to, the economic side of things.
Absolutely. See, with my background, geopolitics and economics, it's clear to me this is way bigger than just two countries, right? Factions, alliances. You've got a whole lot of global anxiety brewing. And yeah, especially when we're talking about the economy.
Right, because the thing that kind of jumped out at me was how, it's not just contained to Israel and Iran. The source talks about markets taking a hit globally, South Korea, Japan, Germany, India, all down. I mean, it's not a pretty picture. So is this like this kind of widespread interconnected reaction? Is that common when things flare up in the Middle East?
Yeah, it definitely raises a red flag. And it's sadly becoming more and more common. We got to remember we're living in a crazy interconnected world now. So what happens in one spot, especially one as, well, volatile as the Middle East, it sends these shockwaves everywhere. Investors get nervous, uncertainty spikes, and suddenly everyone's hitting the brakes on spending. Hence, those market drops mentioned in the source.
So it's like this web, right?
Huh.
Not just isolated incidents. And the source really hits on this idea of the Middle East being like this major player on the world stage. I feel that you're going to say
Yeah.
it all comes back to oil, doesn't it?
You got oil and natural gas. The Middle East is an energy powerhouse, no doubt. And when those supplies are threatened, I mean, whether it's actual disruption or just the fear of it, the entire world feels that squeeze. And that squeeze, well, it usually translates into something I think we're all, unfortunately, pretty familiar with these days.
Inflation. Tell me I'm wrong, but every time I think about heading to the grocery store these days, it feels like prices have jumped up another notch. So is this conflict really going to make things even worse at the checkout counter?
You're right to be worried about that grocery bill because this conflict, well, it throws a wrench into the whole inflation situation. Think about it. War disrupts supply chains. Ships can't sail as easily. Oil and gas production gets thrown off. And those everyday items we rely on, they get harder to find. It's basic economics, really higher demand, lower supply. Prices go through the roof.
Okay, so far, not great news for our wallets, right? But what really made me stop and think was when the source mentioned the U.S. Federal Reserve's plan to cut interest rates. Now, I thought that was supposed to help with inflation, right? So now this conflict is throwing a wrench into those plans, too.
Exactly. The Fed's in a tough spot, no doubt. Cut rates and maybe fuel inflation even more. Or raise them to fight inflation, but risk triggering a recession. It's a no-win situation.
So you're saying this conflict has put the Fed between a rock and a hard place. And doesn't the source also mention something about, like, we've been here before, high inflation, A&D, low interest rates? Talk about déjà vu.
It's a good observation, and yeah, that combo has reared its ugly head before. Back in the 70s, remember. Led to what economists call stagflation. Nasty mix of high inflation, stagnant growth, and high unemployment. Remember those long lines at gas stations, empty shelves at the store? Yeah, that was stagflation.
Okay, stagflation is definitely not a word I want to hear on the news regularly. And speaking of words I don't like, the source also throws around this term economic slowdown. And that doesn't exactly sound encouraging. So for those of us who don't speak fluent economists, can you break it down? What does that actually mean? And more importantly, what would it look like in our daily lives, not just, on Wall Street?
Basically, it means things start to shrink instead of grow, right? So businesses hold back, they're not starting new projects, hiring slows down, you might even see job cuts. People get cautious about spending. Creates this domino effect that can lead to, well, a recession. And we all know what that means. Impacts everyone, not just Wall Street.
Yeah, and it's not like everyone feels it the same way, is it? The
Yeah.
source seemed to be saying there's a particular group that gets hit harder.
Right. It's like, if things do go bad, it's not going to be an equal opportunity kind of pain. Sadly, no. History likes to repeat itself, right? And in those downturns, it's the middle class that tends to take the brunt of it. Remember that quote in the source? Talking about the burden falling on their shoulders. Higher taxes to deal with the fallout, interest rates making it tougher to get by. And then, the long-term stuff impacting opportunities for the next generation. It's something to think about, for sure.
Yeah, no kidding. Reading through this myself, what really struck me was how this conflict, it's not just about like gas prices or what have you. I mean, we're talking about political instability, maybe even humanitarian crises. It's a whole other level.
Absolutely. The economic stuff is huge, no question. But we can't ignore the bigger picture either, right? The geopolitical side of things, the human impact. Like the source said, that whole balance of power in the region, it's delicate. You've got all these different players, alliances. could easily get messy.
It's like the whole world is holding its breath,
Yeah.
So much uncertainty. Speaking of which, there was one thing in here that kind of felt like I don't know, maybe not hopeful, but interesting, at least. It mentioned gold hitting a high. Now, I'm no expert on Wall Street, but isn't gold supposed to be the opposite of a good time investment? What's that all about?
You're onto something there. Gold. See, that's what we call a safe haven asset. When things get uncertain, right? Wars, economic turmoil, even pandemics. Investors, they flock to stuff like gold. It's seen as stable, holds its value when other markets are tanking, and the source is right. Gold prices are climbing, tells us investors are nervous, to say the least.
So it's like a big, shiny warning sign. The more gold people are stashing away, the more worried we should be.
It's not a perfect system, but yeah, it's a signal worth watching. Reflects that feeling of unease, you know? Things are shaky, unpredictable. And that feeling itself can kind of become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people worry, the more they pull back, and that slows the economy down even more.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's all connected, isn't it? This one conflict, as big as it is on its own,
Yeah.
it's like it sets off these chain reactions, impacts everything from global markets to, like you said, humanitarian concerns.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to stay informed,
Yeah.
right? Really understand how complex this situation is and how it could play out over the next few weeks, months. Who knows?
Okay, so let's see if I've got this straight. We're talking about this conflict having these huge global economic stakes, right? Because everyone relies on oil and gas, and that
Yeah.
means potential inflation, a possible economic slowdown.
Hmm.
And the middle class is probably going to feel it the most. Plus, you've got the whole geopolitical uncertainty thing, humanitarian crises. It's a lot.
It is a lot to unpack, for sure. And the big takeaway here is pay attention. How this conflict unfolds, it's going to have ripple effects way beyond the Middle East. Over the next few months, it'll impact everything. Global markets, your own wallet. Not to mention, like you said, those wider geopolitical and humanitarian consequences. It's serious stuff.
So what do we do? It feels like the whole world's kind of just holding its breath, waiting to see what happens.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that level of uncertainty?
You've hit on something really important. We can't control the headlines, right? But we can control how we react to them. The source talked about staying informed, but it's more than just reading the news, you know? It's about understanding what's really going on, thinking for yourself, having these conversations. That's what matters.
Makes sense. Knowledge is power, right? Sounds like understanding is key here, not just freaking out.
100%. And don't underestimate those small steps you can take. The source mentioned diversifying investments, remember? Might be a good time to look at your own portfolio, see if it still makes sense with everything going on.
So it's not just about knowing what's happening, it's about being ready for what comes next.
Exactly. And listen, this deep dive, we've focused on the risks, the challenges, but
Okay.
there's always opportunity, right? Even in times of uncertainty. People adapt, find ways to be resilient, even grow. Don't forget that.
Good point. Easy to get caught up in the doom and gloom. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Really insightful conversation. And I think we all learned a lot about just how far-reaching this conflict could be.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, especially important now.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, stay curious.